We're back in the Balkans. The Greek Civil War is well underway by now, and foreign aid for both sides threatens to turn this into a proxy war. Actually, dramatic new hostilities do threaten the political order of Europe, but not hostilities between East and West. No, on this occasion, it's between Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union. I'm Indy Neidell. Welcome to Season 1 of TimeGhost Cold War coverage in our series War to War, where we follow the wars that wouldn't end within a Cold World War. The beginning of the digital age, the atomic age, and the space age, when we began to replicate our minds electronically, gained the power to end our very existence as a species, and discovered that we can truly reach for the stars. When we last visited Greece, we saw how anger stretching back to the 19-teens and 1920s grew to threaten the social fabric of the nation. World War II and repressive policies by successive governments, including the new one, have ignited that powder keg and sparked a civil war between the communists and their new democratic army on one side, and the government security forces and the Greek National Army on the other. Now, if you were the Prime Minister of post-World War II Greece, you might make a point of not upsetting the tens of thousands of experienced guerrillas there who hate you already, but you are not in charge. In fact, the rising of the communists in rebellion has not deterred the new nationalist government under Konstantinos Tsaldaris. Quite the opposite. In May 1946, his government introduces sweeping new measures to give so-called security commissions the power to arrest people they regard as dangerous based on little or no evidence. The procedure was applied on an unprecedented scale. By the end of the year, 4,876 people were deported and 1,227 awaiting the results of their appeals. And by the end of the Civil War, probably over 30,000 had been deported. This penalty was often imposed in arbitrary ways, but applied especially against supporters, friends, or families of left-wing outlaws. In one case, the gendarmerie chief on the island of Zakynthos was ordered by his regional commander to find 15 people to deport, regardless of their guilt or innocence. In June, the government passes the third resolution, which allows searches of homes without a warrant, suppression of strikes, and harsh penalties for being a member of or showing any support at all for the communist revolt. How harsh? Death. Right. So what exactly qualifies as supporting the revolt? Does criticizing the regime count? The courts-martial certainly believe so, and speaking out against Tsaldaris' government soon becomes evidence of subversion and communist sympathies. 116 people are executed under these new laws in 1946. A further 688 will follow in 1947. Towards the end of 1946, emergency powers are used to arrest and deport left-wing labor leaders and bring the unions under some measure of government control. In October, new censorship laws further tighten the government's grip on public life. Oppressive acts by the police were now not watched helplessly, as before the general election, but actively instigated by political superiors such as nomarchs or politicians. The American authors of the report on the Greeks found early in 1947 that the gendarmes were dreaded in many mountain villages for their brutal and arbitrary actions. British officials were reduced to protesting ineffectively to the government that it was encouraging the gendarmerie to behave in a lawless way, noting that indiscriminate persecution was creating the dangers that it was supposed to be combating. Captured communist rebels or former partisans who had been unable to flee to the mountains, as well as close family members or associates, can expect to be deported to one of a few different prison camps. The most notorious of these camps is on the small island of Makronissos, which is the destination for Greek soldiers or officers with communist sympathies or ties, and runs a regime so harsh that it earns the nickname the New Dachau among leftists. However, because of a sick twist of fate, the similarities in this comparison do not end with just the name. Perhaps more galling for the professional officers who, by fighting for Ilos, had compromised their careers in the post-war army, was that in many cases, the men who condemned them to these horrible islands had either actively collaborated with or passively acquiesced to the Axis. In 1947, over 10,000 suspected leftists and communists were rounded up in the larger urban centers and placed in the detention centers and prisons on the mainland as well as on the islands. Yep, just 2 years after the fall of Nazi Germany, former Nazi collaborators are condemning former partisans to concentration camps. For the prisoners of Macronissos, their rehabilitation includes being subjected to intense propaganda, physical and psychological torture, and execution for those who refuse to renounce their beliefs. For those who do crack under torture, they sign a declaration of repentance, denouncing their former comrades and embracing royalism. To prove their sincerity, they are then forced to participate in the torture of others before being shipped out to fight in the Civil War. From 1948 onwards, Macronissos will begin to accept civilians too. The communists, for their part, certainly don't shy away from brutality either, and they keep discipline in their new army with merciless efficiency. Unlike in their former military wing, Hellas, the Communist Party now becomes increasingly rooted within the Democratic Army and demands complete and unwavering obedience. Political commissars are deployed in each unit to monitor the soldiers' ideological correctness and sniff out dissent. Outspoken criticism of the party leadership, poor battlefield performance, or even simply showing too much initiative are often punished by court-martial with a death sentence, although these sentences are almost always commuted as they just lack the manpower to be killing their own. These changes are generally part of a shift in intent by the communists to transition their forces from a ragtag band of partisans to a fully orthodox regular army. This is the goal of Greek Communist Party leader Nikos Zachariadis, who returned from imprisonment at Dachau concentration camp, the old Dachau, in 1945. How feasible is this though, really? The communists do not have control over sprawling urban centers. They can't produce the huge amounts of weaponry and supply that are required to do this. In fact, they are almost entirely reliant on aid deliveries from the states to their north. Yugoslavia, under Josip Broz Tito, proves to be their main benefactor, shipping the Democratic Army over 35,000 rifles, 5,000 machine guns, mines, clothing, food, medical equipment. Coupled with the leftover British and German equipment that the Democratic Army already has available, that leaves them with quite a mashup of gear in their arsenals. Support from the Soviet Union, however, which could truly stack the odds in their favor, is less forthcoming. There's also currently a hard limit on how large their army can grow, since they have to wait for people to join them in the mountains before arming them, and those numbers are already starting to dwindle as government control and repression ramps up in the cities. To expand their ranks further, they will have to occupy populated territory. So what is their plan to do that? Well, right now the Democratic Army is spread all over the nation, including way down south in the Peloponnese, where they're obviously cut off from the aid from Yugoslavia and Bulgaria. So the first step will be to establish some proper front lines. And by necessity, those front lines will be in the north. A line is selected, which runs from Konitsa through Metsovo, Grevena, and Sotili, before ending at Nestorio. If they can occupy this line and hold it against the government's far larger and better equipped national army, then it would provide a perfect staging ground to grow their numbers and stockpile supplies. It may also have the effect of convincing Eastern Bloc leaders that a communist victory in Greece is quite possible and lead to increased support and material aid. Before that can get going, though, it's the government forces that strike. Operation Terminus kicks off April 5th, 1947, with the 2nd and 3rd Corps of the National Army aiming to push the communists out of the Pindus mountain range before swinging northeast and clearing out strongholds in Macedonia and Thrace. The Democratic Army, still fighting like partisans, manages to evade encirclement almost everywhere, hitting the government forces with ambushes before retreating, though eventually having to move out of the Pindus Mountains and relocate north to the main communist base in the Gramos Mountains. When the government forces press ahead to Gramos, diversionary assaults behind the lines at the cities of Metsovo and Ioannina compel the National Army to withdraw and call an end to Terminus. Communists, now with the initiative, begin their assaults on Grevena, Konitsa, and for the second time, Metsovo, this time for real. They deploy some of their best gear and troops in these attacks, with a force of several thousand plus artillery leading the attack on Konitsa. In a pitched battle, though, government forces proved to be more than a match for them. And contrary to their expectations, the citizenry does not rise up and come to their aid, but instead supports the government. Partly, this could be that civilians can see the writing on the wall and know that communist success here would just mean more war and more suffering for them. However, it's also the most compelling evidence to date that the government's attempts to root out dissent is working as intended. All three assaults fail, and the Democratic Army withdraws to its bases. 1947 now comes to an end. Both sides have had the chance to score a decisive victory and tip the scales in their favor, and both sides have failed to do so. So, a stalemate? Well, not exactly, because there's one key difference between combatants. The National Army is still growing. The Democratic Army is not. And how exactly is that expansion happening? Well, the British, who had been supplying and financing the Greek government so far, are forced to call time on their aid at the beginning of 1947. Economic fallout from the Second World War left the UK pretty much bankrupt, and the new Labour government under Clement Attlee hasn't been able to stimulate the kind of massive economic miracle that would allow Britain to continue to flex its muscles around the globe. That ability and that initiative now belong only to the United States and the Soviet Union. It's the view of Sir Clifford Norton, British ambassador in Athens, that Greece represents a wobbling domino, which, if allowed to topple, could be the first step in a sequence of failures that would allow Greece, Turkey, the Middle East, and most of Western Asia to come under Joseph Stalin's influence. On February 21st, 1947, the U.S. State Department receives a communique from the British Embassy announcing the end of British support to both Greece and Turkey, while stressing the need for Western backing in these regions, lest the whole Eastern Mediterranean fall under Soviet control. The message to the Americans here is clear. Your turn. Don't screw it up. The U.S. ambassador to Greece, Lincoln McVeigh, has watched the repressive actions of the Tsaldaris government with disgust, but chooses to take what some might call a big-picture approach. An ideological justification for this course was at hand in resistance to communist totalitarianism. McVeigh, while condemning the authoritarianism of Tsaldaris government, repeated in October 1946 his long-held view that no terrorism can possibly exist in a country under Anglo-Saxon hegemony, which can be equated with that which accompanies Russian-supported communism wherever it goes. By the following February, the State Department had decided that Greece was of vital interest. Thus, the British appeal was the catalyst for the decision to commit massive aid, which was extended also to Turkey. In a publicity campaign lasting 3 weeks, the U.S. administration managed to win support of a majority in Congress for this shift in overseas policy, from traditional isolationism to massive and sustained interventionism. In a speech to Congress on March 12, 1947, U.S. President Harry Truman announces that, "I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures," pointing to the rise of Stalinist states in Eastern Europe and suggesting that U.S. support is all that could prevent the same fate for Greece, Turkey, and beyond. This marks the beginning of the Truman Doctrine, an ideological struggle to contain communist influence worldwide. Where the communists, and especially the Soviets, expand their influence, so too will the Americans get involved to fight against it. But how involved are the Soviets here, actually? After all, isn't it Yugoslavia committing the majority of support to the Greek communists? Well, yes. And is Tito operating under Stalin's direction? No, quite the opposite. Tito and Stalin have not had the best relationship since the end of World War II, which is down to several factors. First, unlike the majority of Eastern Europe, the Germans were pushed out of Yugoslavia in large part by Yugoslav communists, with only limited help from the Soviets. This led to a much more independently minded government in Yugoslavia, which continues to have goals of territorial expansion and unification with other Slavic peoples, running contrary to Stalin's desire to carefully control communist states through coordination and Soviet authority. Put simply, Tito happily listens to Stalin, but doesn't recognize or obey him as his superior. Stalin is not particularly chuffed about that. The actions of Tito's Yugoslavia in aiding the Greek communists further strain and degrade this relationship. Joseph Stalin isn't very interested in Greece, being skeptical of the Democratic Army's ability to win the Civil War without direct involvement from Soviet divisions and air power. He worries that intervention like that would start a conflict between East and West, potentially compromising his control over Eastern Europe. By contrast, some of Tito's territorial ambitions extend to parts of Macedonia, which no doubt feature heavily in his mind right now. Consequently, Stalin views Tito with suspicion, and his support for the Democratic Army as short-sighted and self-serving. Expressing, shouting his views at Yugoslav delegates in February 1948, Stalin insists that they have no prospect of success at all. What, do you think Great Britain and the United States, the most powerful state in the world, will permit you to break their line of communications in the Mediterranean? Nonsense. And we have no navy. The uprising in Greece must be stopped as quickly as possible. The disagreement and suspicion between the pair reaches a climax in June 1948 when Stalin formally expels Yugoslavia from the Cominform, branding Tito's Communist Party as no longer true Marxists, essentially excommunicating Yugoslavia from the communist world, like a red pope. The fallout from this decision is felt immediately in Yugoslavia as it finds itself isolated, former allies distancing themselves from Tito and shutting down any hope of his territorial expansion. So, which way did the Greek communists turn? To Tito, whose support has brought them this far? Or to Stalin, who explicitly wants them to lose as quickly as possible? Well, to Tito, right? No, wrong. I'm not sure why you'd think that. They side with Stalin. Okay, I'm not sure exactly what they hope to gain by doing that. Maybe Nikos Zachariadis' own personal loyalty to Stalin, which does run deep, is a deciding factor here. Or maybe Zachariadis hopes that his support might convince Stalin to reconsider his views and actively support the Democratic Army. It is hard to know for sure. What is known for certain, however, is that their entire war effort now hangs in the balance. Government forces grow larger, bolder, and better equipped with each passing day. U.S. aid now streams into the country, opening America's pockets to the National Army. Without support from Yugoslavia feeding and arming them, the Greek communists will be in a fight for survival, not victory, by the end of the month. Fortunately for them, Tito does not close the border or stop the shipments just yet. But if they don't reconsider their stance, how long will that last? The future of the Democratic Army now rests on that one man who can seal their fate with a single nod of his head. Will he? Stay tuned for the final part of our coverage of the Greek Civil War, where we will answer that very question. Like Tito, we've got expansion plans of our own, and our army must continue to expand if we are to realize them. Come with us on this mission to preserve history by joining the TimeGhost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Our TimeGhost Army member of the week is Nimrod Johnson. I'd like to meet someone named Nimrod Johnson. I just think I should get that out there. Nimrod Johnson, if you're ever near our studio, free lunch? Yeah?
Yeah, free lunch.
Free lunch, Nimrod. And these are the newest commissioned officers. You bring them with you, Nimrod Johnson. That's cool. It is thanks to the Army we can do what we do, and we're not settling for anything less than total victory in this fight to bring content to you. And if you want a better chance of a shout out at the end of our videos, well, like Nimrod Johnson, then get involved in the discussions in the comment section on Patreon. Let me see your pretty face in there, cracking some lame jokes. Usually at my expense. And next time, just might be you. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.